Eddy. So for those of you who don't know Eddy, he's been a pioneer in the field of aircraft valuation, and he's been in the business for almost 40 years. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Eddy. So I'll hand over to you to take us through your slides.
Thank you, John. I hope it doesn't look as though I've been in the business for 40 years, but let's go. Yeah, hi everyone. John's asked me to do a quick review and setting the scene for today. Part of what we do at Ishka is we look at asset risk and we look at credit risk, and we try to, I sort of simplify that by saying we look at the market, which is the airlines, we look at the metal, which is the aircraft, and we look at the money, which is the finance side of things. And we can move on to the first slide, John. One of the things we do is we provide something called airline credit profiles for the investor market, and we look at airlines from the perspective of their financials, but also we do like an operational review as well. So we try to give like a holistic view of the airlines, and we track about 130 of them at the moment. It's a number that's increasing each month. This table just shows you two of the key metrics that we're seeing in the market today. One is about the financial risk of airlines or within airlines, and then also the kind of government and shareholder support that they get. So if we look here at the bottom left-hand corner, you have airlines that have relatively low financial risk, i.e. they've got unencumbered assets, they've got liquidity, they've got access to cash, and they also have a high level of support, whether that's from the government or from the shareholders. So you've got people like New Zealand, Emirates, Singapore Group down in that bottom corner. And in the top right-hand corner, you've got the airlines that have high financial risk and also little support package from the governments or from their shareholders. So you'll see already we've got Virgin Australia in there, which is already into administration. You have South African there for obvious reasons. In fact, from the crossing the African spectrum, in the bottom left-hand corner, we have Ethiopian, which have relatively moderate finance risk and high support, through to South African at the other extreme. And the airlines all fall into these different categories as we see them. These aren't static numbers. These airlines are moving around within those boxes depending upon the different conditions and how their performance is going and how they're coping with the current scenario. So that's just one picture that we have today. If we move on to the next slide very quickly, we've got what we do now is we track also the weekly capacity evolution, and I think both Johns will be familiar with the kind of data that's coming from OAG. And one of the things we've noticed here is that recently there's been a slight upturn in some of the capacity provided, which I guess is tending to suggest that we may have hit the floor in terms of the way capacities come down. Three of the regions have shown those slight increases. Also recently, I was trying to find out as well as the capacity, what is the traffic picture? And in China, the traffic picture was, I mean, back in middle of February, the traffic was down by 90%. In terms of the passengers coming back, by the end of February, the traffic was only about 70% down on a year-on-year basis. But as of May, that's still a figure of 70%. So the traffic levels haven't increased even though capacity has come back in China. And I guess what we're seeing is, people are getting local freedoms, and we're probably going to see this roll out elsewhere, but they're not quite flying yet, either because of quarantine or other regulations. So there's still a picture to evolve in that space. If we move on to the next chart, again, one of the things we'll look at is the metal and aircraft deliveries, for example. So on the left-hand side here, we've got a chart of the Airbus deliveries. The first 4 columns show us the first 4 months of last year, and you can see Airbus was performing well and delivering well. Then the next 4 columns are the first 4 months of this year, and you can see that the manufacturers are underperforming. They're not delivering for a variety of reasons, and again, the airlines either can't accept the aircraft or they want to defer the aircraft because of the conditions. And if we look at the Boeing chart as well on the right-hand side, we have a similar picture there as well. Boeing in the first 4 months of last year was doing very well. April, of course, suffered from the grounding of the MAX and the lack of deliveries that could be made there. But if we then look at the first 4 months of this year, the figures have been pretty low. And again, obvious reasons there, same as for Airbus. What we've seen as a whole, I think in April, we've seen maybe 14 aircraft deliveries in the month from all the major manufacturers. And one of the things that made me smile a little was Comac delivered an ARJ-21, one of their own aircraft, in April. And we think that was the only regional aircraft that we've been able to identify so far that was delivered. So Comac in China has delivered more regional aircraft than all the other regional manufacturers combined, probably for the first time ever. And they've actually done another one on the 1st of May. So China is making its footprint at the moment. So that's an interesting thing to see. Okay, moving on to the next slide. We're looking at value changes, and this is something we do quite regularly. In fact, more often than we normally do as the market changes. And this is just picking on 5-year-old examples of some of the key types in the marketplace. And then we looked at the values that we had for them on the 1st of January, and then what we had again at the end of April. And there's been various step changes there. Now, some people have said, you know, there's very little happening. How can you sort of track the values and interpret it? Well, even though there's not so many transactions happening, there's still, you know, we know things have happened. We know things have changed. And I tried to do an analogy with referencing VFR and IFR. So if you're flying VFR, you've got visual flight rules. You can see, you know, you've got a blue sky, you can see ahead. And as an appraiser, you can see transaction data, and you can record what's going on. But if you're flying in cloud, such as we are today, you rely on your instruments. So you can't see where you're going in terms of transactions, but you can see all the other dials and instruments, and you can monitor all the other things that are happening, such as aircraft in store, aircraft availability, the kind of aircraft that airlines are stepping down, the ones that are becoming surplus. And we can track all those different things, and you can get a sense of where values are going. And there's also historical precedents. We've got a number of downturns in the past where we've seen value moves. So again, we're making these incremental steps in value to try to reflect the fact that, you know, values are changing in the marketplace. And again, I think just to wrap up a chart on the finance side of things, probably just 3 key points we'd want to make here, maybe start some conversations. We've seen a lot of talk about government bailouts, and there's about $100 billion, give or take a few billion, of bailout or assistance measures for airlines globally, which is obviously a good thing. But the state aid is not, it's not free money. You know, it comes with strings attached. So everyone's treading very carefully to make sure that they can, as an airline, they can still go forward without having too many difficulties or challenges in that sense. We expect the airline debt levels to rise, obviously, because they're having to borrow money. And we know that debt is always a big issue with airlines. And then thirdly, in terms of the financing itself, you know, the banks themselves, their lending has slowed down. A few reasons there. One is they're finding it hard to actually price the risk in terms of understanding, you know, the security of the industry going forward. Secondly, they're putting money aside because they're going to be facing some potential restructurings to their existing portfolios. And then thirdly, within the bank itself, there's competition for funds. You know, some people are looking more at infrastructure and airport supporting, or maybe even other modes of transportation or other investments. So there's a number of issues out there which are impacting the finance side of things. So hopefully that gives everybody a quick roundup of where we see the market today.
Yes, thank you. So, John?
Hello, John.
You wanted to ask Eddy something?
Yeah, Eddy, question already, and you're clearly popular. The A380, does it have any value, or is it best as a restaurant in a car park?
Does it have any value? It's got value. I mean, every aircraft has value at the end of the day, even if it's only salvage or part-out value. And I think some of the early A380s have demonstrated that. It's very hard today for people to see a future where big wide-body jets come into play. But we've been here before. It may take some time for those markets to come back. But, you know, there's going to be, you'd like to think there's going to be a space for a large wide body in the future. May not be today, but going forward.
There was a scary stat. There's lots of scary stats, but I pulled one out this week. for the weekly OAG blog, and I think if you look at the A380, the 747, and the A350, this week there are no scheduled flights by any of those aircraft types compared to a couple of thousand in January, obviously with Emirates and the A380 driving, but the 747 has, or the 400 variant has probably seen its day as well now, hasn't it?
Yeah, like I say, today is not the day for an aeroplane of that size. But you've got to anticipate, bearing in mind the traffic levels we've had in the past, and the growth. And you look at this industry, we're 50, 60 years old in terms of commercial jet airliners. In the next 10, 20 years, there's going to be different kinds of traffic levels.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so.
But the only problem is whether the aircraft can last the course until it gets there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just from my side, Eddy, just before we open this up to the panel and we start asking them, obviously what you do is provide intelligence to potential investors and airlines looking to lease, etc. Do you think you've showed obviously the capacity starting to maybe show a little bit of pickup? Do you think we've hit the bottom in terms of these valuations, and what are you advising as a general situation right now? Are you saying, hey, now is the time to pick up a bargain, or it's still got further to fall?
Unfortunately, I suspect it's still got further to fall. I mean, we're just taking incremental steps in terms of reducing values as more data comes in. I guess, I mean, a lot of aircraft are parked. No one's actually trading at the moment in any substantial shape or form, and that won't happen until people know what the future looks like with a bit more clarity. So when people know what aircraft types people are going to need, what kind of routes they're going to start opening up on, then they'll know what kind of aircraft they need to be working with. And then you'll start to see some movement. And then I guess what's important is not so much the aircraft, how many aircraft come back into service, but what's left on the ground after we return to the new normal. And that's when we'll see where a lot of the value cuts will probably start to occur. So there's more to happen yet. It works both ways, though. It's an opportunity for other people to step in, maybe overhaul their fleets or get a new aircraft type at a much more attractive price. So there's lots of options out there for airlines in terms of regaging or resizing, as well as the issues that people have with existing fleets and the kind of book values they're carrying.
And Eddy, I'm conscious we need to move on because the panelists are full of wisdom and expertise. But I just wonder, and in doffing my hat to Mr. Dunnicky at ATR, who still owes me a bottle of red wine. Turboprops, from the data I've seen at OAG, they look like they're in a better place than anyone else at the moment. Do you think that's the case? Smaller, thinner markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the impressions are that domestic markets will open up first. And if you've got the aircraft in your fleets, people are going to start right sizing to begin with. If the traffic levels are low, you're going to use smaller aircraft. And well, then again, you see, I mean, domestic markets, the big ones are the US, Russia, China. For them, a domestic market is an A320 size or greater. So, but I mean, the utility of a turboprop aircraft and the fact and the places it connects, they're the kind of places that you're going to see movement first, I think. So those aircraft are taking a knock now in terms of value because there is some surplus and there's overcapacity, but they will probably be one of the first to come back into service, I should imagine.
Great. Okay. Thank you. John, over to you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. So I want to bring Sylvain into the conversation. Now, Sylvain and I have known each other for a long time. He's been a good friend of AviaDev during his time at FastJet, before that SAA, and has recently finished a little stint at Qatar as well. Now, I reached out to you, and you were actually one of the reasons that we put this webinar together, because you wrote a really interesting, thought-provoking article on LinkedIn, which was called 4 Tough Questions Every Airline CEO or Chairperson Should Answer Now. You can all find that on Sylvain's LinkedIn. But I wanted to get from your side, obviously at the moment, from an operations perspective, demand is obviously lower. How do you streamline an operation right now? Because of course, most airlines have got too much metal for the current market. So what are the things you can be doing right now from an operational and commercial standpoint to ride this out as best as possible?
Well, thanks, John, and good morning to everyone. And it's very challenging right now to restart because, as you say, I think every airline CEO is completely absorbed by the emergency situation, looking at the cash balance at hand, which is basically disappearing at an incredible pace. And also, we are a very it's a team play in the airlines, right? We have crew. We are used to working as integrated teams, and right now that's very difficult because we all working from our homes through the phone, and we're not used to that. So it's very difficult to make important decisions remotely, concentrate on the immediate cash situation, and at the same time plan for the future, especially when absolutely nobody has got a clue of what's going to happen. As we just said, Eddy mentioned that valuation of aircraft is very uncertain. We can see that there's radical movements, right now decreasing the value of aircraft, but nobody really knows what's going to happen in the future. So what the CEOs should be doing right now is basically try to ignore whatever has been used before in terms of planning and start from a zero base to rebuild what will happen in the next year. I don't believe there will be a fast recovery. And from my 25 years experience in the airline industry, it's very rare that any year ever happens as it was supposed to be happening. And unfortunately, it's usually not happening in a bad way. I mean, we always have ambitious targets, and there's always some kind of hiccup along the way that prevents us from reaching our targets. So now is the time to actually try to do a very pessimistic forecast, actually try to understand whether there is still a business at all to be conducted. It's a time for serious discussions with the shareholders. So you mentioned in your poll South African Airways before. Yes, of course, it's a discussion to be had. I mean, is it really worth it? Re-injecting probably billions of dollars into a business if we don't really know whether there is enough traffic flow to go after in the future. There are other priorities to look at, maybe other efficient allocation of funds. So maybe that's the conversation, the first conversation to have with the shareholders. Do we really have a business going forward, or should we just try and liquidate immediately? And if we do want to have a business, let's try to plan for a really skeleton business going forward and get equipped for that. And from my personal experience in restructuring, it's really important to strike very hard the first time. It's like, in the US, they say you never get a second chance to make a first impression. I would say in restructuring, you never get a second chance to make a second restructuring. I mean, you got to do it right the first time. And therefore, you have to go to the bone immediately, because it's very, very painful to do. And if you do it at once, it's not going to be more painful than if you do it twice or 3 times. So let's do it immediately. Let's take all the radical options to reduce the cost base. And that's the only way that we can try to survive in the future.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sylvain. And I'll come to Steve in a minute to just get his thoughts on that restructuring. That it has to be this absolute, like you say, a painful but really deep for it to work. It can't be done half-heartedly. But I want to come to David Aher, who's the MD at Tuscar Aero. So Dave has been providing advisory and project management, and does now, to airlines, lessors, investors, MROs. He's got 16 years of experience in the aircraft leasing business, and is now focused on the emerging markets, which is how we met through the work that we're both doing in Africa. So for those airlines with a leased fleet, Dave, how should they look at this currently? Is this an opportunity to re-examine, renegotiate their lease agreements? What should they be doing if you are an airline watching this now with leased aircraft? How should you be engaging with those lessors?
Thanks, Sean. Well, I think the first point is to try and establish what you expect your fleet profile is going to look like post-COVID-19. Back to, I think all of us agree that airlines know that their fleet profile pre-COVID-19 will not be the same post-COVID-19. So there has to be huge restructuring, analyze where you expect to see your fleet. It's ground zero, and you're starting to rebuild your profile from now, say for next year and a half, 2 years. Once you do that, the next point of time is, if you have leased assets, you have to do a due diligence on those assets to determine everything from the lease agreements to the financials associated with those assets, to determine which are the right aircraft if you want to cull your fleet, which one you have to do. Now, a lot of the interim activities done by the airline community has been engaging with the lessors to look for rental holidays and payment deferrals, but they won't be forgiven. They'll have to be paid back sometime. So it's an issue now that you have to look at your fleet and decide, okay, will we retain the fleet? Will these aircraft re-enter service in a year and a half or 2 years' time? Or do we feel we'll either first try and negotiate preferential lease terms or reduce rates, or do we decide we just hand the aircraft back? I mean, if that happens, it's going to be a hard discussion to have, and most lessors are not going to accept you handing the keys over and say, pick up your aircraft. There will be return obligations that will need to be complied with. All the discussion will be, are you able to negotiate more preferable terms and maybe pay compensation in lieu of meeting those redelivery conditions? But at the same time, is it cheaper to hand an aircraft back than have it sitting on the ramp for the next year and a half paying rent on it? And also, to a point as well, this debate about newer technologies versus older technologies. There's also consideration about, well, with current fuel prices the way they are, and you know, costs being the key issue for everyone to be aware of. If you have an old technology aircraft, which the lease rental may be 100,000 less per month than a newer technology, and you know you're probably not going to fly that or you're going to fly aircraft for the next year and a half as your business model for your next strategy, then maybe it's a better option to keep the older product and hand back to newer ones. The operating costs are going to be lower, fuel prices, and the rental costs maybe be 100,000 a month cheaper. So if you had that over a couple of aircraft over a period of time, it adds up to a couple of $1 million every few months, which again needs to be a factor part of the equation. So it's a difficult time for leasing community as well. They're exposed financially, but from an airline perspective, I think it's a great opportunity to review your leases and have quite frank but quite hard discussions with the leasing community. I think it's the only way forward, because at the moment, having aircraft on the ground paying rent on them, whilst rental holiday will go for a few months, that there will come a point in time once travel restrictions are lifted and airlines will want to go back flying, the lessors will want to start getting the payment in. And if you're paying for aircraft on the ground and paying rental, it's just a negative sum for you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dave. I think that's, you know, it's really interesting to get that. And all of this, the reason I've kept Steve till last is because, you know, I've known him for some time and he's a restructuring specialist. And so bringing in the aviation side of this to the conversation. But what I want to know from Steve, and for those of you who don't know him, if you've been to an Aher event, you definitely will have seen him. He's joining us bright and early, first of all, from New York City. So he's holed up there in New York City. So thanks for getting up so early. He's a restructuring specialist, not just in aviation, but also in all sorts of jurisdictions around the world, but predominantly in developing economies. So my question for you, Steve, is two things. One is what Sylvain said, which is for a restructure to work, does it have to be very deep and, you know, you only get one chance at it? And secondly, you know, what should these companies, you know, generally be doing right now to position themselves? You know, what can they be doing right now to position themselves from a restructuring perspective for the future?
Thank you, John. I would certainly agree with the proposition that it's best to get the restructuring done right the first time. For one thing, the transaction costs of doing a major restructuring are quite substantial. So to do another follow-on restructuring a year or two later is very inefficient. And so the key elements that need to be addressed in a restructuring should be addressed in that first restructuring. In the US, we have a term for companies that file for Chapter 11 in successive filings. If they do it 2 times, we call it a Chapter 22. And there are even some companies that go for Chapter 33 3 times in Chapter 11. But it's best really to deal with the issues up front and try to get as much accomplished in that first restructuring. The truth of the matter is, in this situation we're facing now with COVID-19, before one even gets to a restructuring, the real challenge is just survival, plain survival, and to continue as a going concern when there are very limited, if any, revenues coming into the company. And so really the airlines need to take a three-pronged approach. The first element is cash conservation. They really have to have a rigorous program of cash conservation and monitoring very closely all cash that's going out of the airline. And to the extent that they can, they should consult with their vendors and suppliers and see if they can stretch out any of their payables. And of course, they should be looking at any receivables that they're owed and make sure they're being collected. But keeping a very careful eye on the cash is absolutely essential and can help ensure their continued survival. The second element is reviewing their liquidity options. If they have a revolving credit facility, for example, they should look at the terms of that facility agreement and see if they're eligible to draw down on their revolver. That could provide some much needed liquidity. They can, if they have outstanding stock, they might consider a rights offering. If they have any unencumbered assets, they might consider pledging or mortgaging those assets to receive additional financing. And finally, as part of that liquidity review, they should consider whether there are any investors they can bring in, strategic investors, for example, that might inject additional equity into the company. The third element, and very importantly, they must engage with their lessors and lenders. They have to review their schedule of upcoming debt service payments, upcoming lease payments. So this is consistent with what we've heard already. But most importantly, at this stage, when they're just trying to survive this crisis, they need to think about arranging forbearance or standstills with their lenders and lessors. The idea basically is to get some breathing space for the period of time that's agreed upon with the lenders or lessors, whether it's 90 days or longer. And they also should be looking at their financial and operating covenants as a result of the crisis. For example, with the limited revenue that's coming in, they may fall out of compliance with various covenants. So they should speak to their lenders and lessors and see if they can get forbearance or standstills. The idea is to get some breathing space. Breathing space by modifying or waiving covenants. And so that's all preparatory to an eventual restructuring. First, they need to survive before they can get to the restructuring. And a restructuring, I won't get into the various dimensions of that now, but they'll need to be thinking about financial restructuring on the one hand, where they would realign their financial obligations. Then they need to be thinking about what we call turnaround, operational restructuring and business restructuring. So at this point, they can give some thought to restructuring issues, but as I say, the main challenge is survival as a going concern, and first and foremost, that focuses on liquidity and conserving the cash that they do have.
But Stephen, if I can come in here, if we take on board what Sylvain said, and I think it's pretty relevant about cut deep, cut hard, and just do it once, and to your comments as well. We have over 100 airlines in Africa. Should we be getting to a stage where we just, accept philosophically there doesn't need to be more than 20 or 30, and that we should, through nothing more than just the process of survival, allow the fittest of the fittest to survive? Sylvain, what's your take on that situation?
Well, if it was the fittest who would survive, overall, there wouldn't be many airlines left in Africa already. It's the sad reality is there is, well, in Africa, and to be frank, in Europe as well, there's a very poor history of profitability. And if we let the market play its forces, we would be left with basically almost no one. Well, I mean, yesterday we saw that Comair of South Africa filed for business rescue. And you can see that is an airline that logged 74 years, I think, of consecutive profit. And just guess what? This single crisis is enough to wipe out this whole history and then put them on the brink. So the reality, and I mentioned that before, I think it's probably time to ask the question, do we really have a business going forward? Or is it maybe time to think afresh and try to allocate our resources to promote aviation, to promote connectivity, but in a different way? There are 100 different ways that governments can influence aviation and tourism, other than owning an airline. Even private airlines are very dependent on the regulator anyway, because they depend on them to obtain traffic licenses and all sorts of authorizations.
Which we know are fraught and subject to perhaps some rather less than transparent decision making that takes place across Africa at particular times, and personal influences can perhaps prevail.
Well, across Africa and across the world
elsewhere as well. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, you think of look at market access in Europe. I mean, Emirates flies more into South Africa than they fly into France and Germany combined. And that's probably the result.
That says something as well, doesn't it, David? From your perspective, as someone who's looking to place aircraft out into the market, that fragmented, large number of potential customers, that must place greater risk into everything that you're seeking to do.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying, I mean, I know it's a difficult time for all concerned, but I think there's also a very good opportunity. I mean, yes, like to what Sylvain was saying about the African sector, where there's a lot of historically in Africa, a lot of emerging airlines have been restricted, might be the word, by national governments not allowing or having competing against their own national carriers. I think it's a great opportunity for airlines that if they have a good business model, I mean, most people are starting from zero again anyway. They're looking at their whole structure, it's ground zero. They're trying to rebuild. I think opportunities do present themselves to if as part of the rebuilding the economy in the country, that you have an emerging airline who is willing to go to the government and say, look, we'll do the heavy lifting, we'll take the risk, we'll take on board the credit risk, we'll fly the airlines, you divert your capital, the government monies to developing other industries or paying the health sector, whatever that's struggling currently with COVID-19. And I think an opportunity then that where airlines may get some concessions is in government levy taxes on airports and so on and so forth, that you start expanding these areas, creating growth within your own economies. Because initially, I think once travel restrictions are lifted, most flights will probably happen within your own jurisdiction, within your own country, because international flights will be very contingent on when governments agree internationally a standardization of accepting people from this country to that country, because they don't know if you come in, you have to go into 14 days quarantine and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I think the key here is to look at ways that it might be, I hate to use the word a cop-out, for some airlines to say, look, we've done our best. COVID-19 is the reason we failed. A lot of them may have entered the system with underlying credit difficulties anyway, and this is an easy way to justify their folding. it may not be a bad thing. I mean, the industry has been plowing along for a long time. If any of us are running our own businesses, there comes a point in time where we can't just expect people to keep putting money in. We have to justify and warrant what we're doing. And if our business model doesn't work for whatever reason, COVID-19 is a good time to reset and say, okay, how do we go forward? So I think there can be optimism in the industry. I think we have to take a lateral approach, to step back and say, okay, the business models of before may not work for the interim because the dynamic of the business landscape has changed. How do we progress going forward?
Sure. Steve,
And
what do you, sorry,
yeah.
Steve, what do you
Sorry?
think about this? It's a fascinating area of discussion.
One of the positive elements of dealing with a restructuring situation is that the company in question here, the airlines, can rethink their underlying business and operating plans. And so they can reconsider all of the fundamental issues that they've dealt with in the past. For example, what markets should they be serving? Should they be more of a regional or even domestic carrier versus an international carrier? But also, this type of situation will give the airlines scope to consider whether they should enter into alliances and code shares and interline arrangements with other airlines. Because as we were discussing in regard to Africa, there may be too much capacity and too many airlines serving similar markets, so that code shares and alliances might be a fruitful way for them to proceed. But and we were also talking, we heard mention of the role of government here. In the African context, that's a crucial issue because so many of the airlines are state-owned. But as part of this whole restructuring dynamic, the airlines should, if they can, try to realign their actual working arrangements with the government so that there isn't micromanagement from the government side, and that the airlines are able to focus on what they should be focusing on, which are the strictly commercial considerations, not political, not governmental considerations, so that they can run a profitable airline.
Okay. Stephen, it's really interesting. We've heard this week about the Australia, New Zealand, the Tasman bubble. Is there an African bubble concept that we should all be thinking about? And in that context of that bubble, you know, it's always struck me, would we be better for Africa, and would it be better for Africa if there was perhaps, you know, a multinational or a pan-African carrier of sufficient scale and mass that had 3 hubs, perhaps one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and one down in Southern Africa? Sylvain, what do you think about the concept of isolating or creating a bubble for Africa?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I'm actually publishing a piece today on the need for a Pan-African carrier. Looking back, I think when you asked me
to ask the question.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. If looking back, looking at Air Afrique in the 80s, I think that was a very smart concept, you know, of countries putting their resources together, maybe with an international financial support, to try to harmonize the connectivity in their sub-region, and making sure that they don't compete inefficiently against one another. I think that was a very smart concept. Today, I think Ethiopian plays a bit of that role, and could be one of the forces in Africa, but I don't believe there should be only one Pan-African carrier. I believe there's space for one in West Africa, or maybe 2, you know, one French-speaking, one English-speaking. There's probably a space for a Southern African player, which used to be SAA, but is now up for grabs. I think that's basically the only way that we can maintain connectivity that is indispensable for Africa, because contrary to Europe or America, there is no ground transportation that can be an alternative. In many cases, the distances are too big the climate and road conditions are too difficult for people to travel by ground. So there is no question we need aviation, but we need to make it work in a way that is going to stop burning cash. And that is probably through coordination, as Stephen mentioned, through alliances and partnerships and codeshare. And I believe that starts with very strong domestic services and building a strong airline to link your provincial capitals to the city, to the economic hub in your own country, and then maybe trying to work to link that to the global network.
It's an interesting time, isn't it? Because we're almost at that sort of point in the evolution of aviation where you could create a very coherent argument for a regulated marketplace, such as that IATA had in the 60s and 70s, with capacity, joint pooling agreements, revenue shares, interline, and all of those sort of things. Brilliant subject to have another webinar about. But John, you've got a question for Eddy, I think.
I have, yeah. I just wanted to ask from your side, because we've had a couple of questions come in on the Q&A, and there's an interesting one here, and I want to try and gauge a little bit of investor sentiment as much as anything else, but just some ideas at the moment. So, we've been asked, it's an anonymous question, but it says, do you think there's a clear advantage for startups now? Now, what Sylvain's just talked about is, this is an opportunity. Steve, the same. You can review everything you're doing, start from ground zero. And obviously, if you're not coming into this crisis with all of those things hanging around you, is it now the right time? And are we seeing people interested in investing in aviation? What's the kind of market sentiment out there from your side?
Yeah, I think we're seeing interest from investors at the moment in terms of looking at distressed debt, looking at picking up some kind of deals or transaction or participation in various structures, cents on the dollar kind of thing. But yeah, this is a market for some fresh thinking. And whenever we have these downturns, you tend to see a new operator comes out of it, new startups, fresh ideas. And you have a clean sheet of paper. You don't have any baggage, not aircraft baggage, but you know what I mean. Baggage in terms of existing structures to work with. So then the question then is, what does the future market look like? Is it the right kind of business plan? The business plan is going to be key and important, always is. And then being able to raise the financing and get the confidence and the comfort of the market in terms of you've got a good idea. People have done it in the past. I mean, there's lots of startups that don't make it. But yeah, it's a good time for people to be thinking about it. And there are good aircraft types out there for the future market as well.
Here's a question for Steve and perhaps Sylvain as well, which is really linked to, has Africa been encumbered with too much public interest and involvement in aviation rather than leaving it to a private sector? And would a private sector have been more successful? I was talking to Agaga yesterday, and he was reminding me any material decision in South African Airways had to go to the government for approval, apparently. And I jokingly said, well, it's just as well economy class catering wasn't included as significant or material. But has there been too much public sector involvement in aviation?
That goes back to what I was discussing in terms of the state-owned carriers and as I mentioned, if the management of the airlines, if they're prevented from operating based solely on commercial considerations, one shouldn't be surprised by the result that there are many unprofitable airlines. And that's not true of all of the state-owned airlines, of course, but where the government will try to micromanage the operations of the airlines, that's very problematic. As to whether there should be privatization of state-owned airlines, that of course is a big issue and deserves consideration, not just in the airline sector, but in other sectors as well. But as I'm saying, to the extent that the airlines do continue to be state-owned, they need the freedom to operate on a commercial basis without political and governmental considerations interfering with their operations.
Mm-hmm. Sylvain, what about, I mean, you've worked for both SAA and Qatar, and whilst Qatar is clearly still state-owned, it has a huge degree of autonomy. Although one person seems to make all the decisions. What's your view?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if autonomy can be one of the descriptions you make of Qatar Airways management style, but it's actually interesting. Those are two state-owned entities, but it's completely different styles. So I think Stephen, said it exactly right. I think it's all about interference, and it's about what is the mandate. And if when you government, the mandate and very often is very complex. It could be a tourism mandate, it could be a economic mandate, it could be a transport mandate, it could be a spatial development mandate, and very often those mandates are not aligned. They are competing against each other, and depending on who is the favored minister at that particular time in this particular cabinet, one mandate will supersede the other mandate. So you end up managing relationship with your shareholder instead of managing your business. And the other thing that Stephen alluded to, I think, about micromanagement is the fact that those state-owned entities tend to be staffed with persons who are chosen not based on their competence, but based on their affiliation, their political affiliation, or their family affiliation. Now,
sure.
That might not be a problem when you run a water board somewhere in a province, because it's not a competitive landscape. But if you look at the amount of talent that is required to run an airline successfully, it's actually very, very difficult, even for airlines who have access to this talent. In Africa, in many cases, it's difficult to get this talent on board. So if you replace them with people who are chosen based on other considerations, you are definitely going for failure. You cannot learn on the job.
Yeah, I guess that word talent may explain why I no longer work for airlines, but that's probably another subject. What I'd be really fascinated to ask all of you, because I am conscious of time, is if 15 years from now, when you cast your mind back to the 23rd of January and the 20th of March, when capacity fell off a cliff and dived into the deepest ocean possible, and aviation still exists, what would be the key learning you've all taken away from this experience? And it is an experience. It might be a horrible experience, but it's an experience we've all been through. What would be the learning you would take away now and then wish to apply over the next 15 years in terms of your knowledge and your management credentials and skills? David?
I suppose everything is cyclical. I think for the first couple of years, people will look at this and they'll restructure and they'll take a zero type approach on rebuilding their business model. But I think in a lot of, COVID-19 is unprecedented. We've had SARS, we've had other various events throughout history. I think a lot of it, the first couple of years may change people's patterns, but I think over time, this will become just another milestone in history. I don't think many people will learn too much from it. I think in the interim time, the next couple of years, they will. Airlines will focus on it, but I think once people start back traveling again, because of the amount of money that's invested in the aircraft sector and the amount it contributes back into economies of the world, I personally think that in a couple of years' time, it'll be business as normal. I generally think it's going to be back to business as normal. Like I said, it will flush out currently. It'll currently will flush out inefficiencies, and people will modify their business models to become more profitable in the interim term. But I think 5, 6, 7 years from now, I think it's going to ramp back up to where it was again. Personally.
Well, hopefully you've kissed the Blarney Stone and you're right. But Steve, what about you from a New York perspective on the world?
Well, I think if the airlines are able to successfully come through this period, looking back, we'll see the airlines that succeeded were best able to navigate their way through a period of uncertainty. this whole COVID experience is fraught with so many uncertainties that it's very hard to do any real long-term planning. And so that will be a test for the management, how nimbly they can navigate the uncertainty. But that ties right back into the restructuring issues, because to do proper restructuring, especially on the financial side, one has to construct financial models based on various assumptions, revenue assumptions, et cetera, et cetera. And this will underline the importance of being conservative in the assumptions one makes. And so I think that's the central challenge at this point for airline management, is being able to survive and navigate their way through this environment of uncertainty.
Okay. Eddy, what about from your perspective, looking at the market and valuations and all of those good things?
Yeah, well, I mean, for the past 10, 12 years, we've had plenty of access to capital, and that capital has chased down deals and became very competitive, to the extent that some people were, you know, accepting greater risk without getting the kind of margins and return on that. And of course, you expect the sun to keep shining, the sky to stay blue, and as we found out, it isn't always the case, and that's when you find problems. So just in terms of looking forwards from the airline perspective, from the aircraft's perspective, you know, every deal's a good deal if you do it at the right price and with a good understanding of the asset as well and what it can do. On the airline side, you know, I think too many airlines have built up too big a debt pile, and then they spend their lives servicing the debt and chasing that instead of trying to run an airline. So I think, you know, better controls on the financials within an airline, not chasing market share at all cost, because that's also a corrosive, and just having that shareholder support and strong management that can steer the boat.
Okay, thank you. We'll leave you to get a cup of tea and clear your throat. Sylvain, what about from your perspective?
Well, you know, I think this crisis shows the importance of planning. We see that some countries have succeeded incredibly well because they've been planning in advance for the worst possible scenarios. And look at Germany, how incredibly well they performed through this crisis because they were prepared. And I think airlines are very good at planning. That's what we do on a regular basis, because we constantly look at tomorrow's bookings and next week's load factors, but we also look at the fleet for the next 20, 25 years, and airports usually plan for 20, 50 years ahead. So we should be good at planning. And maybe what I think could transpire is that maybe our politicians, our governments should learn from airlines on how to plan for the worst, how to be also nimble when it comes to adjusting to shifting realities. And I think there's going to be a lot of airline experts available on the market for governments to hire in the next few months. So maybe there's an opportunity for us to share our knowledge.
Okay, that's interesting. John, I'm conscious that we're at that hour when I run away and my crystal shoes fall off and someone comes and finds me, or it's 12 o'clock. But all of the panelists, just one last question. And it's a bit black and white, optimistic, pessimistic for the future. What do you think will look like? When will we be out of this, do you think? Start with Stephen.
I think it all depends on how pragmatic the airlines are in addressing the situation. So it's hard to make a blanket prediction at this point, but part of the whole exercise of restructuring is dealing with this whole range of business, operational, financial issues in a very hard-headed way, and making some tough judgment calls on whether the business model makes sense and whether the financial model is sustainable. So, as I say, I think it will all come back to whether the airlines are able to deal with the challenges they're now facing in a very pragmatic and hard-headed way.
Okay, David, for you?
Yeah, I kind of tend to agree. I think at this stage it's an opportunity for airlines to reevaluate their position, where they see themselves being in 3, 4, 5 years from now. And I think that the business models they had in the past, I think they have to throw out the rule book to a certain degree, because they're based on certain projections with growth projections and opening up various route sectors and so on and so forth. I think it's a ground zero, but I think it does afford an opportunity if they take a fairly difficult decision to step back and say, okay, what are we trying to achieve? What's our objective? And what will the cost factor be from getting from point A to achieving that goal? And that's where cost, as all the panelists have agreed, cost is key. Cash is king at the moment. But I think that they have to take a very lateral approach as well. They have to look at what options are available to them, how they want to project the recovery process to the flying public as well. And I think a key element as well in this whole process that they have to engage their customers throughout the recovery process, because ultimately they have to. People are very concerned about safety risks of flying now, and whilst the borders may be opened up, it's an element of how do you appease your customer that you're sanitizing your aircraft quickly, appropriately, you're doing social distancing, whatever. I think that's key as well, that how the airlines, especially the leadership in the airlines, handle the recovery process now, and how they represent that to the flying community will help the recovery process going forward.
Okay.
So I think they have to bring their future, their passengers have to come along the ride with them throughout the process.
Wise words. Eddy, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think the traffic will be there. I think the passengers will be there. The airlines are in, or most of the airlines are in pretty good shape before this happened. It's not their fault. So I guess a lot of it is contingent on the virus and the global response to it going forwards. Different markets will run at different speeds. I mean, I think it's already been mentioned, the Australia, New Zealand bubble can open up some routes there. So I think different areas will develop or will respond more quickly. And I think it's just a good opportunity for a lot of airlines to sort of get back on a surer footing. It's going to be a relatively slow response, but I think a positive one.
Okay, good. Sylvain?
Yeah, well, there I beg to differ here. I don't agree at all with Eddy that traffic will be there and airlines will be there. I think a lot of the aircraft that have been parked right now will stay parked and will not come back into service, which means that there will be less capacity and therefore higher prices, and traveling will be less affordable. And at the same time, I think demand will be subdued for the long term. We only started to see the health crisis, but don't forget the economic crisis is now coming. There will be a drop in consumer expenditure for the next 2 or 3 years in most of the developed economies, and people will basically travel less. Not even considering the health considerations, they will have less disposable income to spend on traveling. Also, major tourism sectors will be drastically affected. Think about the cruise industry. The cruise industry is a massive driver of traffic for some airlines. Think of
absolutely Miami, Fort Lauderdale.
Exactly, Miami, but also Singapore, also
Yep.
Dubai, etc. Those are massive chunks of traffic that are not going to come back. I mean, who on earth is going to book a cruise now, unless you really are extremely self-confident?
Well, I booked one for my mother-in-law.
That's a smart move. Yeah, I hope it's not too expensive though. And so yeah, I really don't believe the market is going to recover very quickly, and that's why I believe restructuring has to be done really urgently and drastically.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Panelists, thank you very much. We are going to start to wrap up. I'm going to hand back to John 1, who has a couple of adverts for you, one of which is particularly relevant. You know, we'd love to do more consultancy work in Africa, and as I'm sure you can see, we do know our stuff. John, over to you, and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you to all the panel. Yeah, I just want to say, you know, that the theme that we've been talking about a lot is an opportunity to reset, to reinvent, and I think that's the positive that comes out of this, is don't continue doing what was not working before. This is an opportunity from that side. Obviously, you know, we've got different opinions of how traffic and weather traffic and what aircraft are going to recover, and I think that's another topic, you know, in terms of the future of the particular aircraft as well. That's another topic we should cover. I want to say thanks to all the attendees as well, and the panelists for giving their time. But there's just a couple of things. It's not an advert just to make you feel terrible now, John. It's actually to raise money for an orphanage in Madagascar. We would have been in Madagascar today, and we would have been doing the charity run that we do every year on Friday morning. So we're asking everybody, wherever you are in the world, if you are allowed out of your house, put on a t-shirt. If you have an AviaDev t-shirt, please do. And take a photo and post it on social media with the hashtag AviaDev. You can make a donation as well to the orphanage. All of the funds will go to this orphanage. But we basically promised that we would support them. And obviously, being unable to run the event, we're unable to actually do the run, and they still need this cash to keep them going. So if you can join, we'd really appreciate it. And it's part of what makes our community so special, is the work that you all put in outside of the office as well. There are bigger things at play here. So there's that. Tomorrow we have a aviation quiz. So Sean Mendes, I'm not sure whether he's on here, the COO of Africa World Airlines, is our reigning champion. But if you want to join, Uri and Mike tomorrow are going to run a quiz. If you want to break from all of the COVID things that we're talking about and the negativity, and you just want to have a bit of fun and you want to test your knowledge, please join us for that. You can register at that link, and you can find us on social media as well to register for that. And then the final thing, our parent company Bench Events are running a virtual event, and I'm quite excited to say that we will be doing one of these for Africa as well, coming soon, but on Tuesday. So if you're into hospitality, we're doing a Follow the Sun session. So it starts in China, it'll finish in the US, and taken through the world during the day on Tuesday. So you can register, find out more at hospitalitytomorrow.com. That is everything from our side. I want to say thank you once again to John for being a great moderator as always, and asking the difficult questions. Thank you for everybody for
pleasure. Thank you.
Listening. You'll get the recording tomorrow. You'll get the LinkedIn profile connections for all of the panelists. Follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on social media. Stay as positive as we can, and we'll be back for another webinar very soon. So thanks for joining us, and I've unmuted all the panelists. They can all say goodbye, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.